Hello to you. I do hope you're well. In today's video, we are asking, what is the fallacy of composition? Now, we'll be asking this question in the context of the cosmological argument for the existence of God. So we'll be looking at what David Hume and Bertrand Russell both had to say. They used the fallacy of composition to criticize the cosmological argument for the existence of God. So as I say, we'll be taking a look at what they said and how they use this fallacy, this criticism, to oppose the cosmological argument and to identify what they saw as its flaws. So the best place to start, I think, is by asking, what is a fallacy in general? And very simply, a fallacy is a failure in reasoning which makes an argument invalid. So it is an error or a flaw in the logic of the argument. So it is a problem with the argument structure. Now, we'll be looking at the fallacy of composition, which is all about the assumptions that the cosmological argument makes, the leap, if you like, to a certain conclusion that is made. But in terms of a fallacy, when we're talking about the fallacy, we're talking about the failure in reasoning, which has therefore undermined the argument and made it invalid. So it's very much a criticism of the cosmological argument. And as I say, it's all about the logistics of the argument. It's all about the scaffolding, if you like, upon which the argument is built. It's saying that there is an error, excuse me, don't know what word I was about to come out with then. It is about an error or a flaw in the logic of the argument. So if we then zoom in a bit more and say, well, what is the fallacy of composition? This is the fallacy, this is the error, the flaw of inferring that something is true of the whole from the fact that it is true of the part of the whole. So put very simply in a soundbite, something to get written on a post-it note, it is assuming, and that is the key word, it is assuming that what is true of the part is true of the whole. Now, remember, the cosmological argument is an inductive argument, so it is probabilistic. It does require that you talk about probabilities, but we're going to criticize this argument by saying you cannot assume, you cannot just make the assumption that what is true of the part of something is necessarily true of the whole. And of course, when we talk about the cosmological argument, what we're saying is you cannot assume that just because things within the universe are contingent and have a cause, you cannot assume then that the universe as a whole is contingent and must have a cause, which of course is at the core of this cosmological argument. So it is the error, the flaw, the mistake, if you like, of assuming that what is true of the parts of something, that is true of the things within the universe that you observe, is necessarily true of the whole, that it is therefore applicable to the universe as a whole. So two examples to show why we cannot assume that what is true of the part is true of the whole are the cases of water and a brick wall. So they're just here on the right hand side if you'd like to read along with me. So if we are talking about water, we know that the two parts, the two elements, going back to my GCSE science days now, that make up water, that make up the whole, are hydrogen and oxygen. So if I was basing my entire understanding of water on my observations of the parts, here's what I would find. So if I looked at hydrogen, one part of water, I can see that hydrogen is not wet. If I look at oxygen, the other part of water, I can see that it is not wet. So from my two observations of the parts, I might then assume that what is true of the part or the parts is true of the whole. So the assumption I would make based on that logic is that therefore water is not wet. Now, of course, we know that is the most ludicrous, ridiculous thing you could ever say in the world, isn't it? Because of course, water is wet. And so we would say that that is a fallacious argument. Is it fallacious? Is that how I pronounce that word? I'm going to go with that because it sounds quite fancy. Yeah. But basically, I can see that that is flawed. Just because it's true of the parts that they are not wet, it is not necessarily true of the whole, because I can see from this example, this very clear example, that it is actually true of the parts, but not of the whole. We can also apply this to the example of a brick wall. So, for example, you could see that all bricks in the wall are small. So the parts that make up the wall, yeah, the bricks we can observe are small. Therefore, you might conclude the wall must be small. The wall is small because what is true of the part is true of the whole. But we know that might not necessarily be the case. You could have a massive wall made up of tiny, tiny, tiny bricks. So we cannot assume that what is true of the part is true of the whole. And of course, the problem that's been identified here in the context of the cosmological argument is that you are basing what you've observed about things in the universe. You are basing your entire argument on the assumption that the things you've observed in the universe have a cause, they need a cause, they are contingent. And so you're assuming that the universe as a whole must have a cause. But actually, as David Hume says, why could the universe not be a necessarily existent thing? Why could the universe, as Russell says, not just be there and that's all? Why are we assuming that what is true of the part or the parts has to be then true of the whole? So, to get that for you in a nutshell, the fallacy of composition is assuming that what is true of the part is true of the whole. It is about leaping to a conclusion, leaping to the conclusion that what you have found to be true about the parts, the particulars, is true then of the whole. It is leaping to the conclusion. It is making an assumption without any justified reason for doing so. Another example I've just thought of, imagine you've ordered a pizza from Domino's and you've just had one slice of that pizza and you've gone, oh, that's absolutely delicious. The best pizza slice I've ever had. That means this is the best pizza I've ever had. But what if you didn't realize that they'd actually sent you a half and half pizza, and the other half of the pizza that you've not had a slice of is your nightmare topping? Yeah, it's an extra spicy meat feast, or it's a veggie supreme, or imagine your worst ever pizza topping. You've just assumed from one part of the pizza, from one slice, that it is delicious. But actually, you're going to get caught out there, aren't you, by the time you get around to your veggie supreme half. So we should not be, the point here is, assuming that what is true of the part is true of the whole, because it is not necessarily the case. We should not be leaping to that conclusion. Okay, now our first key scholar who talks about the fallacy of composition in the context of the cosmological argument is David Hume. And he was, it's a bit like a little Twitter bio here, he was a Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, a historian, an economist, an essayist, a very busy man. And he was famous for his empiricism and his skepticism, so for his questioning. And he certainly asked a lot of questions about the cosmological argument. And this is what he said. I will read the whole thing to you, but the most important bit is what I've underlined in bold there. So he said, the whole, you say, wants a cause. You want to find out the cause of the whole universe. He said, I answer that the uniting of these parts into a whole, like the uniting of several distinct counties into one kingdom or several distinct members into one body, is performed merely by an arbitrary act of mind and has no influence on the nature of things. So here's what he says. Did I show you the particular cause of each individual in a collection of 20 particles of matter? I should think it very unreasonable should you afterwards ask me what was the cause of the whole 20. He says this is sufficiently explained in explaining the cause of the part. So he is saying it is very unreasonable, and that's a really key quote. It is unreasonable to say, right, you've observed the parts, now tell me about the whole. He said you shouldn't be doing that. And in the same way with the cosmological argument, we are obviously empirically observing the parts. We're observing things within the world that we're finding are contingent and all have a cause. But he's saying it's very unreasonable to then go, okay, let's apply that to the whole. Let's apply that to the universe as a whole, because you are making an assumption. You are leaping to a conclusion. And it's a great little line there. He says that is very unreasonable. You shouldn't be doing it. Therefore, there is a fallacy, there is a flaw with the argument. Bertrand Russell is another key thinker who invoked, shall we say, who used the fallacy of composition argument to criticize the cosmological argument. So he was a British philosopher, he was a mathematician, a logician, and a public intellectual. Again, another very busy man. And in the mid-20th century, he took part in some BBC radio debates with Father Frederick Copleston on the cosmological argument. And he gave this really interesting version of the fallacy of composition argument to critique the cosmological argument. He said, every man who exists has a mother. So we can see that every man who exists has a mother. And he said, and it seems to me, your argument, he's talking to Copleston here, is that therefore the human race must have a mother. But obviously, he says, the human race hasn't a mother. That's a different logical sphere. So can you see how he's applied this example here? So he's saying, look, you can observe from the individual humans that they have mothers. So individual humans have mothers, but you cannot then say that humankind must have a mother. You cannot assume that what is true of the parts is therefore true of the whole. And he says here, and this is a great line, it's a different logical sphere. Remember, we're talking about the logistics. We're talking about the scaffolding of the argument. There is a problem, there is a flaw in your reasoning. And that, of course, is where logic comes into it. So you cannot move from your observation of parts to making conclusions about the whole. You cannot move from your observations about things within the universe to making a conclusion about the whole universe, because it's a different sphere. It's a different logical sphere. It is quite unreasonable. And so, just to bring this to diagram form, we can see here that the fallacy of composition is a really strong criticism of the cosmological argument, because the cosmological argument tries to be really empirically grounded, doesn't it? It's inductive, it's a posteriori, and, you know, we want it, or, you know, its proponents want it to persuade you with real confidence and with real credibility that God must necessarily exist as the uncaused caused, the unmoved mover. But here's what the problem is. We are moving from an observation of the parts, because we have found that we can observe that everything within the universe has a cause. And do you know what? We can all get on board with that, can't we? That's where the cosmological argument is really strong. We can observe that cause, and we can observe that things are contingent for ourselves. I can, for example, imagine myself existing, and I can also imagine myself not existing. So I can see that contingency for myself. So this part of the argument is really strong in terms of it being empirically grounded, and I can actually observe it and see it. But here's the problem. The argument then makes this assumption, it makes this leap where we go, okay, we can observe that everything within the universe has a cause, so we can see something and say something about the parts, if you like, but then we make this leap in logic, we make this assumption, we make this jump to the conclusion the universe as a whole must have a cause, because we are assuming, let's all say it together now, that what is true of the part or the parts must be true of the whole. And of course, the argument that Bertrand Russell and David Hume are making is you can't do that, because that is a flaw in your logic, that is a problem in your reasoning. You have no justification for doing that. There is no evidence that that will work. Indeed, we've actually seen evidence from the cases of water and the brick wall and your half and half pizza from Domino's that actually it is dangerous to do that, that you cannot do that. And so, of course, with the cosmological argument, that assumption that the universe as a whole must have a cause could actually be undermined. For example, by saying that the universe itself could have been the necessarily existent first cause of everything else. And so that is our look at the fallacy of composition. If there's anything you'd add, anything that you would ask, please do comment down below. But thank you for watching. I hope that might have been in some way helpful for starting to look at the fallacy of composition for A-level religious studies. Take care. Bye-bye.